First of all, let me thank Prime Minister Skerrit for his gracious hospitality and that of his team. It was really a pleasure arriving this morning and being greeted by very well-dressed people. And I say that because maybe under normal circumstances that's not something that we would have noticed. But I knew it took a huge effort. And I want to say that on behalf of my team, how grateful we are for the hospitality and the respect that we've received here today. Prime Minister Skerrit talked about the trip that we had made up north. And I think that both of us were extremely shocked and taken aback by what we had seen. And clearly the evidence that those countries in many regards were not prepared. The level of planning, the level of infrastructure, the capacity to be able to be resilient towards something that had happened to them was very apparent. What was also apparent in our discussions, and I want to thank Dr. Jules in particular from the OECS about 2 days before Irma was going to hit the region, when we decided to meet and really to understand what the preparations that were being made, not necessarily those preparations on island, but those preparations as a region. And that if Irma had gone on the track that it was expected to have gone and would have hit Guadeloupe and Antigua and St. Kitts, that nobody really was preparing for the role that we would have to play in terms of evacuation and immediate support. So without the access of international airports, and knowing that Irma was going to be heading north to Puerto Rico and was also heading towards Miami, and Miami was already starting the process of shutting down, that the places that we would have traditionally have gotten support were not available to us. And so it was Dr. Jules and myself, along with the Prime Minister of CARICOM, the lead chairman of CARICOM, which is Prime Minister Mitchell, along with Prime Minister Gonzalez and also Prime Minister Skerrit, that we started putting things in place prior to Irma's even arrival, and that letting the world know that we would be there and open up our doors. So notices to airlines were sent out, letting them know that they could come and land for free. Notices to the cruise industry that they could use our countries as evacuation points. And then doing a full inventory of our hotel rooms, a full inventory of cargo space, both at the airport and also the dock, so we could facilitate any kinds of evacuations that would have to take place. As Prime Minister said, I did not know that we would have had to have kept our door open for so long, but certainly those things that we did augured well for Dominica, because even before the hurricane had hit Dominica, those same preparations had been put in place. In fact, the helicopter from Trinidad was already stationed in St. Lucia. The Venezuelan planes and also helicopters were on their way. And then we had a very good coordinated effort with Martinique. And I really want to thank the President of Martinique, Marie-Jean, for his assistance, dedication, and his empathy. It was his planes that flew over Dominica initially, and his helicopters that were able to give us our first reports about what had happened in Dominica, and facilitated the movement of cargo and of rescue services here to Dominica. I want to really bear witness to the strength of your Prime Minister. I think that what has happened here today would have broken a lesser man. And I'm extremely encouraged by his strength, his fortitude, and obviously his stamina, because I've been through Hurricane Tomas. I know what it is to be working during the day, dealing with the government business, and dealing it with at a very high level in terms of pressure, and then having to leave here and go to your constituents. And as a Prime Minister, your constituents are the entire population. And so literally, you're on your feet all night to then have to return back to work here. So I don't want anybody to take what is taking place here for granted, in that the size of the problem and how do we deal with it. So as I've indicated in many interviews, there is 3 very real stages. One is obviously on the initial phase, dealing with the emergency, the humanitarian needs of water, food, taking care of people, and getting people to feel safe again. Then there is the cleanup process of now starting to give people hope again. And then the third part is the rebuilding of the nation. So as brothers that we've spoken about, the OECS countries, and I'm always at liberty to say on behalf of the chairman of CARICOM, all of us, that we're all going to play a critical role in helping make sure that Dominica is back on its feet as quickly as possible. I'm asked a question and said, boy, you must be lucky that you were not hit. And I always say, yes, we were not physically hit, but the fact is we live in a very small ecosystem here in the Caribbean. And that when St. Martin, St. Thomas, St. Croix, Puerto Rico, BVI, Anguilla, Barbuda, and now Dominica are affected, then we're all affected. Like Dominica, St. Lucia has many nationals that live in the BVI and were earning incomes that they were sending back home. The farmers from Dominica who depended on those markets. And the same thing applies in St. Thomas and St. Martin and St. Croix. And it is because of our presence in those states that we have been pushing very hard to remind the United States, the British, the Dutch, and the French that we have every right to be sitting at the table and having a discussion as to what's going to happen in those countries. We have a vested interest in to see what's going to happen in those countries. And clearly this storm, or storms, and I call it the perfect storm, because not only did we have Irma, but we had Jose, and we had an earthquake in Mexico, and now you had Maria. It shows us how vulnerable we are, not only physically, but also economically, and that there are changes that we have to make, and that we continue looking north to the solutions of our problems, when in fact we have to be looking south. So Panama as a source, what Venezuela has done for Dominica and for Barbuda and Antigua has to be mentioned and has to be qualified, and we have to say thank you for what you've done. But that we also must recognize that we are all part of together, and we should not continuously be waiting for disasters to understand that. And all too often, maybe some of us leaders have to share some of the blame, that we keep on going to meetings and thinking that we're independent and acting independently. So I think that the OECS has been a greater example in the Caribbean of leaders that work together and that we're agreed to give up some of our own individual sovereignty to have things like a central bank, to have things like an economic secretariat. And so for our citizens who question sometimes the rationale as to why we spend money on having an OECS, it is days like today that the answer rings very clearly why we do. In terms of moving forward, we have a mammoth task ahead of us. I know many Dominicans have not been able to watch TV and to watch the cycle that has been taking place, and that it moved very quickly from Dominica to Puerto Rico, and then with this mass killing that took place in Las Vegas, that's now become the new issue. And that's the reality of the world that we live in, that it's very fast moving, and you have to try to take advantage of opportunities when they exist. And so the work of myself, of Prime Minister Gaston Brown, and I also want to thank Prime Minister Skerrit. I know how difficult it must have been for him to decide to leave Dominica to come to New York. And I want to say to Dominicans, it was well received. It was the right thing to do. And more importantly, that he took advantage of the time that he made in New York. The speech that he gave is a speech that we can all endorse. And I think that the way that he articulated the conflicts that we have in describing that this is a war zone and that we're in a war, and a war that we didn't start. And the war that he's talking about is the war of climate change. And so we're on the front line, and other people are making decisions for us, but yet we're being asked to bear the full brunt of that responsibility by ourselves. And I think there was no better time and no better person to have delivered that message at the UN. I think it's directly as a consequence of him being there and the impact of his speech that the Secretary General of the UN is going to be coming here this weekend. And I have to say to you, after driving through Dominica, that I have to feel, and I am actually assured, that he will be emotionally impacted by what he's going to see here. And the level of vulnerability and the level of helplessness that we all suffer from because of what is taking place, and the power of Mother Nature and what is left in its raft. And I believe that as a new Secretary General, I am convinced, and certainly in the discussions I had with him, that he will become a champion for our cause. And again, I'm sorry that it is the people of Dominica who've had to suffer to this extent in order for us to make that message known to everybody. But let's make sure that it's not in vain. We have important meetings up in Washington, D.C. next week. We've been able to now get a high-level meeting with the major countries in the world in hopes that we can get what we've been saying for years, that the Caribbean cannot be classified by one measurement when it comes to whether we're a middle income or high income or low income, but more importantly by one measurement to determine whether we should have access to aid money or have to pay for commercial debt. So we're hoping at that meeting that we've finally been able to convince everybody that the Caribbean and small states like ours need to be classified on a vulnerability index that the Secretary General was talking about. That would go a long ways in allowing us to help ourselves. Because I know one thing about us in the Caribbean, nobody's looking for a handout. All we want is a fair chance, a fair opportunity to be able to take care of ourselves and to prosper. And you know, when I come here and I see the extent of the damage, but I see people up and around, cutting wood, cleaning up their homes, and getting on with life, makes me proud to say I am from the Caribbean. So Prime Minister, on behalf of all solutions, let me wish you all the best to continue to give you the assurances that St. Lucia remains Dominica for the foreseeable future. Anybody coming to our country is like they're arriving in Dominica. And we will continue to be a hub, both for supplies and for people to support your growth and reestablishment. So again, I want to thank you for your hospitality. I want to thank you for your leadership.